crash. The roar of the engine grew louder. The plane shook so much that the luggage racks opened and things began to fall on the passengers. Artem pressed himself into his seat, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. People were screaming, someone was sobbing, and the pilot's voice continued in a breaking tone. "Prepare for an emergency landing. Put on your life jackets." The woman next to Artem tried to feel for a life jacket under the seat, but her hands were shaking. Artem grabbed his own, pulled the belts with shaking fingers, but at that moment the plane suddenly banked to the left. People screamed. "Hold on!" a man shouted across the aisle, clutching the armrest. Artem felt his stomach rise up into his throat. They were falling. Lightning flashed through the window, revealing an endless ocean. There was no land, only black water heaving in the gusts of wind. The plane vibrated. The sound of metal, as if torn by giant hands, made everyone freeze in horror. Suddenly, the nose of the airliner sharply dropped. Gravity knocked Artem out of breath. Someone from behind screamed, "Oh God! We're going to crash!" The woman next to Artem grabbed his hand, squeezing it so hard that he felt his bones ache. Her face was wet with tears. Impact. A dull roar, and the world exploded into chaos. The plane crashed into the water. The shock wave threw Artem forward, the belt cut painfully into his chest, knocking all the air out of him. There was a crack around him, the hull was breaking in half. Water gushed in, icy, like knives, piercing the body. Silence. Then, pitch darkness. Artem woke up in the water, gasping for air. The salt water burned his throat. Tongues of flame were flashing around him. The wreckage of the plane was burning on the surface of the ocean. Everything was swimming before his eyes, but he knew one thing. If he stayed here, he would be pulled to the bottom. Somewhere to the side, a muffled voice was heard. "Help!" He turned and saw a man clinging to a floating chair with all his might. His face was covered in blood, and his eyes were full of fear. "Hold on!" Artem shouted and swam towards him. The waves threw them from side to side, threatening to separate them forever. The rain lashed the water, making it difficult to see. A silhouette flashed far ahead, an island. "Look, the shore!" Artem shouted, helping the wounded man stay afloat. He had almost no strength left. The wind was in his face, his clothes were pulling him down, his muscles were burning with fatigue. But he kept swimming, knowing that there, on the shore, either salvation or a new, even more terrible struggle awaited them. The first steps to survival. Artem didn't immediately realize that he had reached the shore. His body was heavy, every breath was difficult. He squeezed his fingers, feeling wet sand beneath him, and with an effort rolled over onto his back. A gray, gloomy sky stretched above him. The roar of the ocean was in his ears, and somewhere in the distance, the burning wreckage of the plane was crackling. Someone groaned nearby. Artem sat up abruptly. Pain pierced his body, but he didn't pay attention to it. The man he pulled out of the water was alive, but his breathing was heavy, and there was dried blood on his temple. "Hey, can you hear me?" Artem shook him by the shoulder. The wounded man groaned, opened his eyes, and muttered something. Artem looked around. The island seemed deserted. Dense jungle began behind him. The ocean stretched out ahead. The waves rolled slowly onto the shore, as if they wanted to take back those who had managed to get out. Search for water. Artem suddenly realized how dry his throat was. The salt water caused a burning thirst, and his tongue felt like it had turned into a piece of sandpaper. He stood up on trembling legs and looked around. There was no time to waste. They would not last long without fresh water. Listening closely, he heard a quiet murmur. It was coming from somewhere deep in the island. Leaving Maxim by the shore, Artem moved towards the jungle. Stepping carefully, he made his way through the thickets, feeling his clothes catch on the thorny branches. Suddenly his feet sank into the mud. There was a small lowland ahead, from which a thin stream was breaking through. Artem fell to the water, greedily scooped up some with his palms, and brought it to his mouth, but stopped. What if the water was dirty? There could be bacteria, parasites. He remembered that in the movies people boiled water before drinking it. "Damn," he muttered, leaning back. But there was no choice. He took a cautious sip. The water was a little salty but bearable. Okay, it's better than nothing. He remembered the place and hurried back to Maxime. Making a fire, Maxime looked bad. His face was pale, his breathing weak. Artem helped him take a couple of sips of water, but realized that without heat, he might not last until morning. Fire. He needed to make a fire. Artem began collecting branches, dry leaves, and bark. But how to light it? There were no matches. He tried to remember how people in the movies twirled a stick to get a spark. He tried, and nothing. He tried again, only abrasions on his palms. Come on, he breathed out, hitting the stone against the stone. Silence. Maxim suddenly stirred and whispered with difficulty, In pocket? Lighter? Artem rushed to him, searching his pockets. And there it was, a small plastic lighter. His fingers trembled as he clicked the wheel. Spark, again, spark. And finally a weak flame flared up on the edge of dry leaves. Artem carefully blew, and after a few seconds a small fire began to flare up. Warmth touched his face, and he felt as if a weight had fallen from his shoulders. First night Maxim was no longer shaking so much. The fire was helping, but his condition was still alarming. Artem understood that they needed shelter, otherwise the rain or cold wind could kill them. Looking around, he noticed several large branches washed up on the shore. They could be used to make something like a hut. He quickly built a primitive shelter, covering the branches with large leaves. It was unreliable, but at least it protected him from the wind. He had no more strength left. Artyom sat by the fire, clutching his head in his hands. He didn't know where they were. He didn't know how many more people had survived. In the distance, from the dark jungle, a long, low sound came, like a growl. Artyom froze. This island wasn't so deserted. The fight for life awakening in a new world. Artyom woke up from the cold. The night was long and hard. The fire, lit in the evening, had almost gone out, leaving only a weak glow of smoldering coals. His clothes were damp, his body ached, and his muscles ached from fatigue. Maxim was breathing weakly nearby. Artyom reached out and touched his forehead. The skin was burning with heat. Damn, he whispered. Maxim was tossing and turning in oblivion. His lips were moving, but the words were incomprehensible. Delirium. The fever was gaining momentum, and without medicine and clean water, he had no chance. Artyom threw his head back, trying to calm down. Panic is the worst enemy. You need to think. You need to act. First, water, then food, then medicine. His fingers clenched into a fist. He could not afford weakness. Search for food. The sun was already rising when Artyom set off into the jungle again. The shadows of the night had retreated, but that did not make the island any less dangerous. His stomach clenched with hunger. He had not eaten since yesterday, and there was a long way ahead. Treading carefully, he moved deeper into the island, carefully examining the plants. Soon he noticed a tree with large green fruits, wild papaya. Excellent. He picked one fruit, broke it with his hands, and a sweet aroma filled the air. Hunger overcame caution. He bit off a juicy piece but barely had time to chew as his heart sank. There were tracks right under the tree. Fresh, large, looked like paws. He slowly looked around. A branch in the bushes moved. Warmth ran down his back. It was not the wind. Someone was nearby. Artyom did not wait. He picked a few more fruits, pressed them to his rudi, and barely restraining the desire to run, moved back. But as soon as he took a step, a muffled roar was heard from the thicket. His throat was dry. He did not see who it was, but he felt it. The creature was watching him. Artyom took another step back. The branches swayed again, and then he took off. He ran as if there was a fire burning behind him. Roots caught his legs, branches lashed his face, but he did not stop. There was a clatter behind him. Almost running to the shore, he noticed Maxim. "Get up!" he shouted, but Maxim did not even move. The clatter stopped. Artyom turned around, clutching a stick in his hand. Silence. It did not come out into the open. Something was hiding in the jungle, and it was not afraid of them. Water and medicine. Later, having made sure that the danger had passed, Artem realized that without fresh water and medicine, Maxim would not last long. Remembering that some vines contain clean water, he found one, cut it with a knife, which he had picked up among the wreckage of the plane, and saw how transparent drops ran down the bark. He put a coconut shell under it and waited until at least a little liquid collected. Maxim drank greedily, but the fever did not subside. This is not enough. Artem bit his lip, trying to remember which plants help with fever. Cinchona bark.
He had heard that it contains quinine, a natural medicine. With a new plan, he went into the forest again, but now slowly and carefully, avoiding noise. He found the right tree at a small clearing. Having cut off the bark, he crushed it with a stone and poured water on it. Maxim took a few sips with difficulty. Night of dangers. They fell asleep by the fire, covered with wet rags that were left from their clothes. Somewhere in the distance, a long, ominous scream was heard. Artyom opened his eyes, clutching a sharpened stick in his hand. He knew one thing. The island was not empty. An hour on the edge of life and death. Artyom woke up with a strange feeling that something was wrong. Everything around was quiet, but this silence was oppressive. The gray sky hung over the island, and with each hour it became more and more gloomy. He felt that something had changed, but he did not know what. His body was exhausted, and every rustle made him shudder warily. But it was not just fear. This was the very moment when you feel that you are on the edge. Maxim lay motionless, his body seemed fragile and lifeless. The fever did not subside. Even though Artem had given him everything he could, water, medicine, leaves, nothing helped. His eyes were closed, his breathing was weak, his lips were deathly pale. Artem clenched his teeth, unable to do anything more. He couldn't lose. He couldn't afford to lose his only companion. But what do you do when all you can do is fight the void? Artem shook Maxim by the shoulder, his hands were shaking, but he didn't answer. Out of desperation, he grabbed him by the hair and with a light tug forced him to stand up. Maxim. Maxim, can you hear me? There was no answer. Only a weak, hoarse breath. Time was running out. Artem understood that if he didn't take immediate action, he would be left alone. But what to do? The island was merciless, and all his efforts were in vain. He couldn't help but notice that his own strength was fading, his body was exhausted, and his mind at that moment was focused only on survival. The island, a complete, soulless desert. He looked around. As if the island itself was an enemy, waiting for them in the darkest corners. He knew he couldn't sit back. He couldn't just wait for something to happen. He couldn't panic. He had to find another way. Another chance. As always, his survival instinct kept him moving. Thoughts raced through his head. What if there was something here that he had missed? How many times had he looked into the jungle and seen only a threat, without noticing what could help them survive? As soon as this island had taken on the role of an enemy, it had become a trap for them. Without looking back, he turned and headed deeper into the jungle, certain that solutions were hidden in this dark forest. With each step, he understood more and more, the island was not just merciless, it was cunning and full of secrets. That very moment when he smelled a smell, strange, tart, bitter. It was a plant he had once seen in old encyclopedia pictures. At one point, it even seemed to him that he had seen it in his childhood, in old books, when his grandfather was telling him about useful herbs. He hurried to pick it. It was something like bark, but with sharp leaves and a pungent smell. It was geranium bark, which had medicinal properties. It could reduce fever and help with intoxication of the body. He knew that if this moment was missed, it would all be over. He rushed back, tearing bark from the ground, clutching his last chance in his hands. A test of determination. When he returned to Maxim, he was still lying in the same position. He had the feeling that the island itself had shrunk around them. As if all his obstacles, all his fears had squeezed them into a trap. "Hold on," he whispered, lighting the last fire. The fire crackled as he cooked the brew, not allowing himself to even glance at Maxim. He knew he had to act quickly. The situation was getting worse with each passing moment. When the decoction was ready, he brought it to Maxim, barely holding back the trembling in his hands. But this was not a simple act. This was a test not only for his body, but also for his mind. At that moment, he understood that his every move, his every action was not only a fight for Maxim's life, but also a fight for his own soul. He could have simply given up. He could have given up everything, but he knew, if he gave up, the island would take them both. He carefully poured the decoction into Maxim's mouth, watching his every move. Fear squeezed his chest, but suddenly, Maxim took a deeper breath, his fingers moved. Artem could not believe his eyes. Artem, Maxim's weak voice barely escaped from his throat. Artem's heart almost jumped out of his chest. He grabbed Maxim by the shoulder, not believing his happiness. "You're alive. You're alive." Maxim smiled weakly, his eyes trying to focus, and it was so painful and illuminating at the same time that Artem could hardly hold back tears. He had never known that he could be so close to the edge and at the same time so close to salvation. "New choice. We need to move on," Artem said as soon as he felt that Maxim had grown a little stronger. He knew that everything would change for them now. The island might be an enemy, but they were not going to give up. Sometimes the hardest thing is to find the strength in yourself to continue when everything around you seems lost. But it is in such moments that determination is born. "We will not give up. Let's move on." Artem looked into Maxim's face. His voice sounded firm. Now, despite the pain and fear, they were ready. And the island, with its dangers and dark corners, was no longer their fear. It had become just another obstacle that they would overcome. Several days passed, but there was not a moment of peace. The island revealed all its secrets with each passing hour, every corner was riddled with threats. However, Artem and Maxim, despite their wounds and fatigue, continued to fight. Maxim began to come to his senses little by little, although his body remained weak and dried out by the heat. His legs could hardly support him, but he did not complain. He knew, if they wanted to survive, they had to move forward. Artem, feeling his strength fading with each step, supported him, almost rising with his last breath. But determination shone in their eyes. The island was dangerous, but they began to realize that it was not so much the island that determined their fate as their own willpower. Step by step, they walked along the coast, moving further and further away from the crash site. The horizon line disappeared, and with each step the island seemed less threatening, more familiar and passable. At some point, Artem noticed a figure appear on the horizon. He stopped and looked closely, hoping that this was not a figment of his imagination, not a hallucination. Maxim also turned his head, his face was still pale, but his eyes were sparkling. A ship. Artem felt his heart beat faster. This was a real ship, not an illusion, not a mirage. The figure of the vessel was getting closer and closer. He clenched his fists, not believing in this miracle. He did not know how much longer they would have been able to endure if not for this last hope. Last effort. Despite his fatigue, Artem ran forward. Maxim fell behind a little, but Artem knew that he had to hurry. A feeling burned in his chest that now everything depended on this moment. With each step he was getting closer to his salvation, but new obstacles were encountered on the way, dark rocks, hidden pits, ominous animals, but none of these obstacles could stop him. When the ship was very close, Artem looked back at Maxim for the last time. He followed him, breathing heavily, but not giving up. At that moment, Artem realized that despite all the cruelty of the island, he was not alone. They had survived thanks to each other's support, and now they were on the verge of salvation. He shouted, "Hey! Hey! We are here. We are alive." His voice was hoarse, but full of determination. The ships did not notice them at first, but as soon as Artem waved his arms, people appeared on the deck. Everything happened quickly. The rescuers threw a rope, and despite all the fatigue, Artem felt his last strength leaving at that moment. When he was lifted on board, he could not hold back his tears. He could not understand whether they were tears of joy or just a reaction to the long-awaited respite. Finding himself in safe territory, he turned to Maxim. His friend was still walking, but now his steps were less confident. Artem, despite his exhaustion, could not leave him. "Hold on, Maxim. Just a little more, brother." Maxim smiled weakly and stepped forward, confidently. When they were both on board, rescuers rushed to give them first aid. Their lives were saved. New World. On the deck of the ship, Artem looked around, watching the calm sea, which had previously seemed so alien and dangerous. But now he knew that the ocean, with its storms and tempests, could not defeat a man. They were alive. Maxim fell asleep on the stretcher, and Artem, despite his fatigue, felt empty. He did not know what would happen next. Perhaps they would return home, perhaps other trials awaited them. But he knew one thing: he and Maxim had been through this together, and now nothing could break them. They had become stronger than they had been. With every breath, with every glance at the raging sea, Artem realized that this fight was not just a fight for survival, but a fight for the future. A future that they would build together, despite all the difficulties they would have to overcome. Concluding thought. And so, when the ship finally left the dangerous island, and its last outlines disappeared over the horizon, Artem realized that they had not just survived. They had found the strength not to give up, they had found light even in the darkest moments. They lived. And that was all they needed.